Thank you all very much. It was interesting when I got here yesterday. Sorry, when I got here yesterday, I had a presentation all worked out. I had slides and everything, and it was great. And I'd worked on it for weeks, and then we had dinner last night, and something happened in the middle of the dinner. They ran the piece about Richard Dreyfuss. And interestingly enough, that little clip of Richard Dreyfuss and the things that he was saying on Bill Maher's talk show got one of the biggest applause lines of the night. And so, first of all, how many of you were not here for dinner last night? Okay, so not many of you. So most of you saw that, so I don't have to read everything that he said. But afterwards, I was talking to several brethren, and they wanted to know more about that. And because Akram Elias, did I hear that Akram is not going to be here Sunday? Did I hear that correctly? He will be here. Okay, so you may want to ask him about that while he's here. But I was going to talk about, I was going to call it, How Dare We Be Masons? And I was going to talk about how Freemasonry can dare to exist in the woke world of 2022 as a 300-year-old organization. We're exclusively for men. We allegedly have mysterious secrets going on. We require potential members to have a belief in God. We're almost entirely based on European Enlightenment philosophy and illustrated with allegories from the Old Testament of the Bible. We enforce an extraordinarily antique code of morals and ethics. We appear to outsiders to be simultaneously all-powerful and elite, yet, as one Washington Post reporter called us, a bygone bunch from an unwoke era. So as the eminent international scholar and social commentator Greta Thunberg once said, how dare you? But last night at dinner, they showed the clip of Richard Dreyfuss. And Dreyfuss was actually made a Freemason at sight on June the 10th, 2011, by the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. And he was subsequently made a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. And if you don't know what its site is, ask me later because it's too long to get into right here. But in 2001, he had started in a video program that was called Mr. Dreyfuss Goes to Washington. And it was written and produced by Right Worshipful Akram Elias, who was a past Grand Master of the District of Columbia. And during that shoot, the men discussed Freemasonry, and Dreyfuss expressed a strong interest in the fraternity at that time, and especially in its historic role in advancing and supporting the new United States of America. And he said at that time that he'd been a Mason in his heart ever since the age of 12. And he was honored to be one of us now. And he appeared on Real Time in 2007, and that was the comments that you saw last night. And what he was he was trying to set up a national civics education program that would be available to schools. They wanted to teach teachers how to teach civics because, frankly, I think we've seen in the political landscape in the last 10 years, nobody seems to know how to teach physics anymore, much less how to put it into civics anymore, much less how to put it into practice. And so those comments that he made, he said this 13 years before the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton presidential race and 17 years before the unbridled madness of the last couple of years. And if you consider that the kids who were alive when Dreyfuss spoke those words and his warnings took place in their first national presidential election, took part in their first national presidential elections since then, it's pretty obvious from the nonstop protests and attempts to stop or resist the proper functions of government that parents didn't teach reason, civility, logic, and debate to their children, as he hoped we all would. Now, I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what you thought of the most recent elections. What's important is that American society appears to be on a fast track to losing the car keys and the owner's manual for our democratic republic. And this is how and why we all have got to dare to be Freemasons. Because in the modern world, in this new millennium that this Masonic Con is celebrating, we're already more than a fifth of the way through it, and more than any time in our history since the end of the 1700s, we Masons have the ability to teach our members and our fellow citizens to answer the question, what am I responsible for? instead of helplessly crying, "Just tell us what to do," as Dreyfus said in his comments. And that veers into what I was going to sort of talk about today and why I was up till 4 a.m. last night. After the end of the American Revolution in 1783 and the adoption of the Constitution in 1788, the very deep-thinking brain boxes back east, who had carefully crafted the intricacies and the operating for this grand experiment of the first modern democratic republic, realized that enormous problem on their hands. Now, no nation had ever before been completely invented and built entirely from scratch. Virtually every single American citizen at that time was an immigrant of some kind or another, and virtually every American citizen at that time had grown up knowing no other form of government besides a monarchy, or living under the rule of a colonial government who was serving a king. Worse, lots of them were illiterate, and even if they could read, nobody had any experience of how to hold an election, nominating candidates, understanding what it meant when they were suddenly told, nobody cares where you originally came from, nobody cares what language you speak, what church you go to. As of today, we're all Americans this morning. That had never occurred before. And something had to be done because Westerners who were out on the wrong side of the Allegheny Mountains and flooding farther west suddenly were going to have the very same boats that all those smart cosmopolitan brain boxes back east who thought they were geniuses in designing all this, suddenly their vote was going to count just as much as those guys. And they had to teach this. Don't think that politicians calling American citizens deplorables or whatever the 18th century name for smelly Walmart people may have been, that's not a 21st century development, not by far. So visionary Masons in Pennsylvania and Virginia, you heard John Bizak talking about Lexington Lodge, they issued distant charters for Masonic lodges specifically to educate and unite a faraway and disparate population of rough pioneers behind the ideas that they believed would sustain and grow this new country, of improving the world one single man at a time, building this country one single man at a time, binding them together as brothers in Masonry's shared vision of tolerance, faith, charity, and understanding, teaching them how to govern themselves as a tiny little democracy locked in a room, how to vote, how to debate, how to win or lose arguments without shooting each other out back, serving as officers, public speaking, even encouraging them to strengthen their own religious beliefs and study Enlightenment principles and the liberal arts and sciences that most of them had never heard of in their lives. The Grand Lodge of Virginia sent Masonic charters into the wilds of the farthest western frontier in Kentucky, who then sent charters into Indiana and the Northwest Territories and beyond into what eventually became 13 different states. That was the influence just Virginia had. The Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania sent charters across Ohio. They sent them up the Mississippi River about the same time and for the same reasons. My own Grand Lodge of Indiana chartered lodges in what became Illinois and Missouri. Just as an aside to you California Masons, a few decades later, my Grand Lodge in Indiana gave dispensations to Indiana Masons who were coming out for the gold rush in California in 1849. And the next year, Indiana's Sierra Nevada Lodge under dispensation meeting in Grass Valley became one of the founding lodges of the Grand Lodge of California. Madison Lodge number 23, which by the way was Grand Master John Trunner's home lodge. So there you go. There's an Indiana connection for California. The founders who established the United States realized that the only way our unique form of government could ever function and survive the uglier side of basic human nature was if the majority of its citizens were what they called habitually correct in their actions. You see it all throughout the Federalist Papers. Madison, Jefferson, Adams, all of them said it over and over, that the country's future depended on its founding virtues of honesty, courtesy, responsibility, industriousness, marriage, religious devotion of some kind among its citizens, the very sort of code that we as Masons have held on to and had at that time and continue to teach our own members to this day. Those were the foundations of what became known as what became called the civic religion. And they were all passed on from generation to generation, what Lincoln would later call the mystic chords of memory, issues of citizenship and solidarity. From the start, American Freemasonry was designed to be part of the ongoing mission in this country as it grew, to teach our members to be the functioning leaders and maintainers of the democratic republic. That's why you find so many Masonic leaders throughout American history. For more than 2,000 years, the people of this nation learned these same basic rules from birth, whether they were rich or poor, third-generation Americans, or just stepped off a boat or a plane from a distant country. Family, schools, media, books all reinforce them. But that doesn't happen now. It's sort of like living all alone in a cabin in the woods on the frontier in 1789. I mean, you know, with Zoom and Amazon and Uber Eats deliveries, but it's almost the same. In a world of almost 7 billion people, loneliness is one of the top causes for suicide in this world. We have a problem. New information is coming in now about not millennials or Generation Z, but the next ones, what some people are calling the iGens, the children born in the year of the Y2K, end of the world, year of 2000. Remember that? We're all going to die in year 2000 because the clocks wouldn't switch right. These kids have spent the majority of their lifetimes with an iPhone in their hand. They're now just starting to hit their early 20s. Nobody wants to admit it out loud, but men today are increasingly lacking positive male role models that other generations have had all along. That's something we can provide. I hope nobody here is offended by this, and I'm not singling anybody's lifestyle or family or anything else out. I'm just saying the nation's great human experiment with fatherless children and single mothers has been a prize-winning catastrophe. 40% of all US children are born out of wedlock today. 57% of African-American children born out of wedlock. Less than half of American kids under 18 are living in a home with 2 married parents in their first marriage, what's quaintly called a traditional family household. That family structure has been a fact of nature and a successful blueprint for human race for 10,000 years all over the world. But today, more than a third of all American kids are living with an unmarried parent, almost always single mothers, without a father or a live-in male partner of any kind to raise and educate and be a male influence on them. All of that affects us directly as Masons in the future of our organization. When I wrote Freemasons for Dummies 18 years ago in 2004, there was still a chance there were enough grandfathers left from World War II or maybe Korean War era that had been Masons in sufficient enough numbers that many grandchildren had at least encountered our fraternity in their lives. But fewer kids today have full-time fathers than ever in recorded history. Because Masonic membership has also steadily fallen since 1958, even fewer kids have a father or a grandfather to pass along older traditions like Masonry and numerous other important values. When you take into consideration all this stew, it's clear we have a shrinking chance of being passed along to the current and future generations by many fathers, grandfathers, siblings, uncles, or other influential men in their lives. We're disappearing through no fault of our own. The Scottish Rite Northern Masonic jurisdiction did a survey 5 years ago, and they found that 8 out of 10 respondents had at least heard of Masonry, even if they didn't know what the heck it was. But in that same survey, less than 30% actually knew what the values of Masonry were. And the most common question I get asked by non-Masons under 35 these days is, what the hell do you guys do? What's the point? You've probably heard it too. We know the point, but they don't. We have an awful lot of men in need right now. I combined this trip to this convention this weekend with a visit to my mom down in Orange County. She's 93 years old, and we've just brought in hospice. And my family's weird. We've got 5 kids from 3 different dads. We're more like we're not really a family. We're sort of like the fellowship you develop with fellow passengers during a bus plunge, you know, as you go over the cliff. I love you, man. You know, it's that kind of thing. But we are a family, and we're supporting each other, and we're sharing duties and caring for her in our own way. But my wife and I, we don't have kids. Her 2 brothers had no kids. Her parents are both dead. Both of her brothers are dead now. So who's going to care for us and phone for hospice when our times come? Thankfully, I've got all of you, because that's what it's going to come down to. Every year, the growing majority of kids born in the United States have no brothers and sisters today. Family sizes have plunged dramatically. You know, families used to have 5 and 6 and 7 kids. Now, sure, that was back when it was likely that 4 of them probably wouldn't reach adulthood before dying of some terrible disease. So you did it to beat the odds. But still, in the 60s and 70s and even on into the 80s, you still had families with 3 and 4 and 5. Hell, we had some that had 7 kids. Those were excited Catholic families in that neighborhood in those days. They're all born in November. Did you always notice February is a cold, lonely month? Oh, well, anyway. Siblings are who teach us all the basic skills of communicating and interacting with people from the youngest possible age. You'll learn civility, sharing, settling arguments, self-control without choking each other, or sometimes with choking occasionally. But you'll learn it in most cases over a long period of time of living with each other as kids, because living together as kids forces you to get along. Only children don't get that experience. If you're an only child, chances are you're going to have some deficiencies in those skills. Again, I'm not pointing at anybody. I'm just telling you these are trends that appear over and over and over. A lodge helps you to learn or maybe relearn those skills, like family. We demand respect for each other, and we learn to accept each other's differences and opinions and kooky ideas and rambling speeches. Our differences and our opinions with courtesy and with understanding. And if we don't, we're not doing it right. Recent Pew polls have shown that North American men have been drifting away from the sort of organized mainstream faith traditions of the mainline churches that their families followed for generations. Over the last 15 years, religiously unaffiliated Americans have been steadily growing in number and currently make up about 1/3 of the current population now. When such men knock at the door of the lodge, they more and more frequently answer our question concerning a belief in God by saying, well, you know, I'm spiritual, not religious. And many may never have thought about it at all before we ask them. Many of them sense that they're missing something important in their lives that faith provides to an awful lot of other people. So many of our future petitioners will be moral and spiritual ciphers. They're hunting something they can sink their teeth into that reaches into their heads and their hearts, but without understanding why they need it. They just know they do. Our especially esoteric-minded observant-style lodges that are growing across the country in popularity are exactly the kinds of organizations such men can be attracted to, in part to perhaps explore different notions of spirituality and discover their own paths by having these discussions with other experienced Masons without fear of censure or ridicule. They're certainly not going to find that in college anywhere. They're certainly not going to find it in a high school anywhere, but they'll find it in a Masonic lodge. A buddy of mine once quipped that of all the miracles that were attributed to Jesus Christ during his lifetime in the Bible, the very greatest miracle of all was at the age of 33, Christ actually managed to have 12 good friends in his life. Yeah, think about it. Yeah. Plenty of guys these days worry about just how trustworthy their friends really are, or whether they can be depended on in a crisis, especially the men who have no real family to fall back on. But Freemasons often offer something better, stronger than just mere friendship. The lodge is where we experience the bonds of brotherhood that are stronger than most friendships, because brothers aren't the same as friends or acquaintances. Brothers mean what they say, because brothers live by a code. That's why we take these, that's why what we take at the altar, it isn't an oath, it isn't a promise, it's an obligation. It's a big part of the real genius behind our fraternity and our methods. Consider that Masonic lodges can still survive with fewer members, but successful democratic societies like ours may not so easily do so without Masons. When the first Grand Lodge formed in England in 1717, it deliberately sought to unite feuding Whigs and Tory political foes, nobility and shopkeepers, Protestants, Anglicans, Catholics. A half century after they were killing each other during their own civil wars. The 1720s, Jews were welcomed into lodges too for the first time in English history. Tolerance, cooperation, honor, trust, and the emulation of those role model men in lodge who could best get the job done or best get along with everyone else. We say it at our meetings, every meeting. The emulation of those who can work, or best agree. Deliberately neutral ground like a Masonic Lodge meeting that expects better, thoughtful, enlightened behavior from its members may be just the place to start rebuilding this fragile nation that Richard Dreyfuss spoke of, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must else have remained at a perpetual distance. That's what James Anderson originally told us it was meant to be in 1723. You're a Biden voter, you're a Trump voter, you're a Sanders guy, you're the only guy in here who voted libertarian. It's lonely, isn't it? You're brown, you're black, I'm pasty white. I try and neutralize the blue at the beach and you can spot me from space. Could one of you guys hold on to my wallet and my house keys for me? Could you guys make sure my wife is okay if I wreck the damn BMW convertible I'm driving around for rent like a nut? You're dumb enough to rent it to me. I'm dumb enough to crash it. Oh, and I'll give you my ATM and my PIN number too, just for safekeeping. There isn't another group of people I would ask those things. Nobody much talks about honor these days, but we do. That's still our basic mission right now. Not charities or perfect ritual or Grand Lodge paperwork or title chasing or Masonic degree tourism. No, our mission really and truly is that hackneyed old phrase, we parrot back year after year, making good men better ones, because that's the only way you get a better world. Thank you. I had to stay up till 4 a.m. more often.
You willing to take some questions?
Sure, I can take questions.
Okay.
This will descend into madness, I'm sure. Yes. Anybody? Yes.
So what do you think is the cause of the downfall of nuclear family?
There are so many, it's funny. I'm a real big one for always trying to hunt out. I always want to know that first domino that tipped over, that sent the whole thing spiraling out of control. And I'm always trying to look back. Where did it all start? Where did it start to fall apart? And I think you could probably peg it. It's always arbitrary, because you're going to always find something else. I usually peg it with Dr. Pincus's invention of the birth control pill that allowed you to start choosing whether or not to have a family at all, or when you were going to have a family. My boss always said, well, we can't afford to have kids, really. And he said, you know what? If you wait until you can afford to have kids, you will never have kids. And he was exactly right. Out of 5 of us, only 2 of the kids in my family decided to have children of their own. And one of them only had 1. We came from a family of 5 kids. We hate each other guts anyway. But what's funny, we get along, don't we? So, where did it begin? You trace it. Once you could control how many kids you had and when, that sort of starts it. And then you can start spreading out from there and making choices about where are you going to live? Since you don't have kids, you don't need grandma and grandpa's help to watch the kids on the weekends. You go get a job somewhere else instead of staying right there in your hometown where, everybody worked in the same companies and everybody went to the same movie house every night and you'd all watch all these communal things we all used to do. Somebody talking about singing in there, singing in bars. Nobody sings in bars anymore together. Nobody knows any songs in common anymore. That was demonstrated last night with the music we were supposed to be singing. Really, was it My Way? Sammy Davis was singing or something? Hell, I don't know. Anyway. You know, and so, you know, one by one, these communal things start breaking apart, and all those connections to the way things were for several hundred years all start to split up. Mobility becomes easier. And then once you get up to the point where companies start offshoring manufacturing and the closing of factories, and suddenly everything is disrupted that way. And suddenly one guy's great union salary suddenly can't afford to have 5 kids and the split level ranch house in suburbia and a car for him and a car for mom and all of that. And then there have been legislative and government things. It wasn't until the 1930s that government started having safety nets that did things that, like us, the fraternal groups would do. There were over 1,000 fraternal groups in the United States in 1910. And an overwhelming majority of them did things like they provided death benefits, burial insurance. Go to an old cemetery. If you see headstones that are shaped like fallen tree trunks, well, you got that if you joined the modern woodmen of the world. And one of the benefits of paying membership dues to them was they give you a free headstone when you died, and they sent a check to your widow. Government took over those things. Even the Shrine hospitals today, 10 years ago, we used to say, we have everything another hospital has, but we don't have a billing department. Well, they got involved in having to take part in the government insurance programs, and that turns into a legislative nightmare and a paperwork nightmare. And pretty soon they have to have a billing office because it's the only way it works with the government programs. So where do you peg it? Where do you say it all started to fall apart? I don't know. There's no starting point for it. It's just, there's no point in looking for hobgoblins about it. This is where we are today. This is what we have to deal with. This is what we have to work with. So anyway, I'm not big on assigning blame because usually I'm responsible. But yes. Thank you. Thank you. Sure. 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 Sure, because the schools are placed in a rotten position. I don't care what you think of the curriculum. I don't care what you think of, the teacher with a bald shaved head on one side and green on the other and a silver, thing through her nose. She may be teaching the Roman history class, but there's only so much a school can do that has got to be done by families. And instead of families, you get a single mom and the kid is raised for the first 5 years in a daycare center. And just becomes this anonymous squalling piece of flesh on the floor. So, I'm not sure how you get schools convinced that they need to follow, go back to the old models. Nobody wants to go back to the old models. Oh, that's from a tin type era. You can't teach that kind of history now. I had 2 people call me. I also wrote RVs and Campers for Dummies with my wife. And we got a couple of notes from people just in the last 3 weeks saying they tried to take their kids to Virginia to see the historic sites of Jefferson's home at Monticello outside of Charlottesville, and Madison's home, Montpelier, which is also outside of Charlottesville. And in both places, they said, if there was 30 seconds of that tour devoted to mentioning the names of Jefferson or Madison, that's about all it was, because everything else about it had been converted by a new woke board of directors, that everything about it from the time you stepped on the property to the time you left was telling nothing but the slavery side of those locations. Nothing about the genius of either of those men and what they created in their time and place. And so I'm not sure how you can get that cranked back into school. I don't know. And one of the things that the study that I mentioned that was done by the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, the Scottish Rite was, and they spent a lot of money, a lot of time working on that survey, was that people just don't know who and what the Masons are anymore. They know us now from National Treasure, people giggling over the stonecutters, what they read in comic books, what they read in the From Hell comic, you know, what else? I mean, that's about it. You know, if they perchance read the only positive thing anybody's written in the public press or the public media or novels was Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol, and that was 2009. Like a love letter to fraternity if you haven't read it. I don't know how you get the message out, but the Northern Masonic jurisdiction provided all that material, all those posters that you saw, More Than a Man, a Mason, and they put together a whole advertising campaign just to get the name and the word out there and try and express what some of our values were, because when people were told what our values were, told the kind of things that we were trying to pass on to people, they went, yeah, I joined that organization. I didn't know anything about that. You know, we thought you guys were a bunch of goofballs putting weird mystical symbols on the back of the dollar bill. So, you know, it's tough. I mean, this is why I pop up on these stupid Freemason programs on the History Channel, because I take the opportunity everywhere I go to talk about this fraternity and try and tell our message to people, because nobody knows it anymore. So I don't know if that answered anything you asked, but you know, it went on a long time. That's not what it tells it. So, yes.
First, I want to commend you for your bravery and your passion. I was sitting next to you last night at dinner, we had a conversation about this, and I'm happy that you actually chose it. I want to ask you if you think that it's possible that the plan, the sea of masonry trying to create a true brotherhood of man, is actually working. And when we look at things in maybe a 5 or a 10-year span or 20-year span, it's easy to look at things are very destructive and things are getting bad. But when we look at history, when we look at long term, 50 years, 100 years, 250 years, things are always getting better. So I know I went through a long phase where I would look at small pictures of history and we look at how bad things are. And then we look at how bad it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It is truly the best it's ever. So is it possible, given what you said and given what we see in the world, that the plan is working and that the destruction of the nuclear family, of the old kind of mindset, the old tribal mindset, where there was, you know, America was the experiment beyond theocracy, beyond monarchy. Is it possible that this is actually going to work out after chaos? There was chaos before France. There was chaos before the American Revolution. There was chaos before the Russian Revolution. Is it possible that long term you're seeing growing pains, but we're seeing the human race become more conscious and abandoning the old idea of the tribal mindset of nuclear family and looking and seeing each other as the human family and the true brotherhood family. And they won't just see masonry as their family, there's a stepping stone. It's possible that we are heading towards the possibility of the ideals of America, this grand experiment that man can govern himself, but this time it'll work on the world stage. And I know we spoke last night, you said it might be not be possible, but a lot of people didn't think it would be possible to unite 50 states. And if we can do it with 50 states, I think we can certainly do it with 195 countries.
Okay. I think what I said to you last night partially was. Oh, I'm sorry. I think partially what I said last night was utopianism as a concept is a beautiful thing to imagine. Unfortunately, there is one constant thing that utopian movements have had in common ever since the first one came about, which is it completely ignores human nature, basic human nature that cannot change. Human nature about self-preservation, about protection of their family, of their neighbors, of their trade. It expands out, and your commitment gets a little softer the farther away and bigger it gets. They don't work. They've never worked. And you know, we were talking last night. One of the things that came up last night when we were talking about was there was a movement to have a one common international language, and it was called Esperanto. And it was created by a linguist, German or Swiss, I can't remember now. And I think he published it. He actually published it in a book called Dr. Esperanto in 1910. And it became this hot topic. And you know, they suddenly had all these people that were fascinated by this concept that if you had a common language, you could unite the world and we all would get along. And then World War I broke out. And then you had the League of Nations that came after World War I ended, and then that led directly into World War II. The Esperantists got up and said, now, well, World War I, we've learned from that. And the League of Nations is a step, and we'll do this universal language, and now we'll all get along. And Hitler publishes Mein Kampf, and he places the Esperantists on the same par with world Jewry and the Masonic conspiracy. So World War II happens, and then it dies. Well, there was a Masonic movement that popped up along with it. It was called the, oh God, it's out of my head now, the United Language Freemason. I remember what it was. I actually did a blog post of it. If you go to the Freemasons For Dummies website and type in Esperanto, you'll get it along with the William Shatner movie that was made in the 60s called Incubus, where he's speaking, the whole cast speaks Esperanto through the whole thing. He can overact in any language. It's amazing. I know every generation thinks the next generation is going to destroy the earth. And every generation has its starry dreamers that says, you know what, if we go into the 23rd century, it's going to be just like the United Federation of Planets. And we're all going to get along on a galactic scale, you know, and it could happen. Either thing could happen. Don't know, can't predict it. Nobody can. So all we can do in our spheres of influence, Masonic or not, just as people, is be a better role model to other people around us. That's all you can do locally. So. Yes.
Seems how we're not going to conquer the world with a new language. Actually, I think English has become like that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Everybody speaks English. People can ask me for my passport in any language. Piss pot? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So we got that. So what do you think about the prohibition within the fraternity of recruiting members, given the fact that a lot of people actually do recruit members? Do you think that it might be time to, given the value of what we have to share?
Oh, we absolutely have to. That is something. You know, it's like the Shaker movement was in rural Ohio and Kentucky. They were established, and one of the first things they had on their list of things that they believed in was total celibacy. Talk about a way to destroy your organization in one generation. You know, apart from kidnapping, I'm not exactly sure what you do to solve that problem. But yeah, and so I don't know how many jurisdictions are left in the United States anyway that completely forbid recruitment. In Indiana, hell, we got rid of that 18 years ago. Even when it was still on the books, the Grand Lodge would get up and tinker around with the code and then announce that they had billboards all over the state. And so, especially when this Northern Masonic Jurisdiction ad campaign came out, and by the way, they offered it to everyone in the world. Every Masonic organization in the world is welcome to use the material that they put together, and they have very specific requirements of how to use those materials. But it's being that campaign is being used by something incredible, like 125 different jurisdictions plus individual lodges. I know England used to be completely the other way around. They had to ask a potential candidate to join. And in the United States, it was completely the opposite. And you had the stupid situations of a father walking around for 60 years waiting for his son to come and ask for a petition for the lodge. He's got it, wadded up in his pocket, this moth-eaten sheet of paper, waiting for the son to ask, and he never did. And so yeah, again, see the shakers. So yeah, I think even if it's on the books in any American jurisdiction, I don't think anybody is living by it anymore, because the numbers have gotten so catastrophic. I mean, once you leave this room, and I'm sorry, Bob Davis, he's an immediate past grandmaster, and I refuse to beat up on him for that reason. But you know it. The day you walked into the office and you thought it was all going to be hearts and flowers and visitations in the country, and instead the first thing they show you is the balance sheet, and the second thing they show you is the continuing plummet of membership on a monthly and daily basis. And then, somebody comes in and says, well, here are the few memberships we got, and here are all the deaths, and here are the guys that were pissed off and walked away, and here's the guys that moved and left no forwarding address. And you just want to blow your brains out as a Grand Master. It's like, well, I'm glad it's like being the captain of the Titanic. Somebody play Nearer My God to Thee out on the promenade deck. So, yeah. And so everybody at this point is like, we've got to do something. It's like Mel Brooks and Blazing Saddles. Gentlemen, we have to protect our phony baloney jobs. We got to find a way to solve this, which is why you have every Grand Master, quite literally in the United States since 1960, every one of them getting up saying, yes, we've lost some members this year, but next year we're hoping to really bring the membership up, and everything will be hearts and flowers again. We actually had 1957 was our highest year. 1958, it starts the downward trend. By 1961, our Grand Lodge established what they called a Millennium Committee, because they wanted to plan for the year 2000, starting in 1961. And they came out and they said, it's projected that there will be, God, I don't remember, it's like there will be 2 million Americans. No. There will be 4 million Americans by the year 2000. They were off by 1.5 million. And we all have to start building much bigger Masonic lodges to handle the crowds of Masons that are going to join in the coming years. Go out and build the biggest Masonic buildings you can find right now, with the biggest facilities you can, because it's all going to come. And our committee is signed off on it. We've got the stats to prove it, and we all know what happened. So yeah, now it's a full-blown catastrophe, and everybody's grasping at straws and life preservers trying to figure out what to do. I don't think anybody is abiding by that stuff of no solicitation. So anyway.
Okay.
These are like Obama answers that go on for 40 minutes without taking a breath. I apologize. I'm sorry.
It's great. All right. Yeah. Thank you.